success. We saw the Australian drought, which is the Argentina drought that was associated with low solar in 2008 and 9, and that affected the crops there. The same time you have a drought there, you usually get very, very wet in central Brazil, in the Sao Paulo area, where they grow sugarcane, oranges. It's the number one producer of orange juice and coffee. We said that could affect all of those, but especially sugarcane. And sugarcane was severely affected a couple of years ago, and sugar ran to 27-year highs. It even went higher this year for problems in other areas. India was also affected, as I said, by the monsoon. That's the number 2 sugar country is producing country is India. Number 1 is Brazil. So knowing that and knowing what was going to happen, we can give people who trade in the market a heads up on sugar being a good investment. We told people that the wheat was going to run to very high levels, and indeed it did. But we also have been warning for the last few years about corn, partly because of the heavy use of corn and ethanol, which we think is a mistake. But
I do too.
But also because of the late planting that we saw in 2008, 2009, and again this year. They had up until a week ago only 19% of the corn planted in Ohio, and we're way behind the normal for planting. And the later you get the plant in the ground, the less the yield is likely to be, and the more vulnerable you are at the other end of the growing season to an early frost. So that doesn't mean that you can't have a decent crop if the weather cooperates, and we don't get an early frost, but the chances are diminished. And today the USDA came out with their report, and they cut back on their forecasts of production, of ending stocks at the lowest level in many years, and since 2006 and 7 at least, and some believe at least that in the market that it could be more like 17 years since it's been this bad.
I noticed that you do take what's going on with the sun seriously. Unlike many of the people who look and evaluate climate and weather, I appreciate that you actually are taking the sun into the equation for weather and climate. And I think it's a big deal. Do you, like Jim Wett, do you take in or do you plan to take in any information about any other planetary bodies and their effect on weather and climate maybe in the future?
Jim Witt was, what he had to say was sort of astrology up until last year or two. A lot of people say, the planets, come on, give me a break. But they're finding more and more that the sun's activity relates a lot to the larger planets and their position in space relative to the center of mass of the solar system. And it causes increased gravitational forces that causes changes in the magnetic field on the sun, and that's where the sunspots, live. So they believe that the Jupiter and Saturn, the big planets, play the most significant role in that. Jim also thinks the other planets, even Mercury, and can have a significant effect on the weather at shorter term. And they haven't looked at that, but they're starting to make the connection and use those factors to predict a number of major solar observatories and solar scientists have used those factors to predict that this last cycle was going to be a dud, that the solar minimum was going to be very long. And indeed, it was. We've had over 820 sun-spotless days, this solar minimum. That's more than double the average, and 3 times or 4 times the number of the last 4 or 5 cycles, the last 50 years. So this was a very significant, quiet, long solar minimum, and they're using the planets to predict that indeed for the next couple of decades we should see a quiet sun. So Jim has been ahead of his time, and he uses it to predict daily weather. They haven't gone that far, but at least they're starting to recognize that the planets may play a role in the sun. The sun is playing a role in our climate.
It's interesting. That's really a whole systems perspective. What do you think about Yellowstone and that supervolcano, which is obviously changing, and it's one of the supervolcanoes in the world? Do you have a concern about it?
Oh, yes.
Talk to us about what your take is on this.
Well, eventually, the last eruption was huge, and it dwarfed any of the eruptions I mentioned. History of man. It would have a major catastrophic effect on climate, and long-lasting too. Most of these volcanoes are short-lived, have an effect that usually fades out after 2 or 3, 4 years. Pinatubo in 91, and El Chocón in 82, Mount St. Helens 81. That time frame, they lasted about 3 or 4 years of a cooling of the Earth. But a major eruption like that could have much more substantial effect.
Wouldn't it put us into an ice age?
If you're heading into that direction anyway, and we're 10,500 years into this interglacial period, and most of them last 10 to 12,000 years. So we're coming to the end of our warm period. That something like that could kick you with all these other factors, the sun and the oceans moving that direction anyway, into a more significant cooling and perhaps a major glaciation. That's something to worry about, not a 1.7 millimeter rise in sea level in a year.
There's a site that says that researchers report the supervolcano underneath the state of Wyoming has been rising at a record rate since 2004, and that its floor has gone up 3 inches per year for the last 3 years, indicating the fastest rate since records began in 1923. Kind of scary. Weather and industry, let's talk about it.
Yeah, most industry needs weather information. They have computers that help them decide where to supply what if they're chains, they're large chains like Walmart or Sears. Yeah, where to in the stores, what part of the countries needs to have above normal number of air conditioners, or what areas are going to be extremely cold, so that we can be sure we really stock up on winter clothes, snowmobiles, snow throwers, blowers, shovels, and so forth. And with our ability to predict the weather, we can benefit industry. We told Lowe's, for example, 2 years ago that last year was going to be a brutally hot summer all through the East, but this summer is going to be much cooler. It may start a little bit warm, but it will be cooler, more like 2008 than 2010. And they can use that in their decision-making. Most of them have supply chain management software that they use that looks at the economy, that looks at last year's store sales, that looks at local population changes, and the overall economic numbers, how well people are doing on unemployment and so forth. But weather is also a factor that they need to factor in. We worked with Pep Boys about 8 years ago and looked at all of their products and found 9 or 10 of the products were very significantly correlated with weather. And some of it is very obvious. The windshield wiper fluid is heavily correlated with snowfall in winter. Obviously, and as you keep having to clean your windshield from the salt and spray from the car in front of you, you're more likely to have to go and get replacement, bottles of antifreeze and windshield wiper antifreeze fluid. And so that's one item. And so no